woman's single act of mercy could hang her from the gallows, yet Evelyn Carter drew water from the well anyway, the bucket trembling in her calloused hands as the Apache warrior stood before her in the dying light, a fever-scorched infant bundled against his chest. The year was 1878, and the Arizona Territory knew only one law for those who aided the enemy: death without trial, without God, without burial in consecrated ground. But before that twilight moment shattered everything, before the dust of Fort Defiance became stained with accusation and blood, Evelyn Carter had been nothing more than a ghost in her own life. The silver mines had swallowed her husband Jabez Reed whole 3 winters past, leaving behind only his name in the company ledger, and the crushing debt that bound her and her 2 small children to the Banning household like livestock. Amos, barely 7, carried water buckets that bent his spine. Ruth, 5 years to her bones, scrubbed floors until her knees bled through her threadbare dress. And Evelyn herself worked from the first crack of dawn until the stars burned cold and distant. Her hands raw from lye soap, her back screaming from the endless labor that kept the Banning estate pristine and profitable. Deacon Banning ruled Fort Defiance with the iron certainty of a man who believed God had personally granted him dominion over lesser souls. His wife Prudence possessed a gaze that could strip the flesh from bone, her thin lips forever pursed in judgment. To them, Evelyn was contaminated goods, a woman without a man's protection, therefore without value, without voice, without the basic dignity afforded even to their livestock. But it was their hatred of the Chiricahua Apache that truly defined the Banning household. A venom so pure it poisoned every whispered prayer, every Sunday sermon, every hushed conversation that died the moment Evelyn entered a room. The land itself remembered different masters. The mountains held secrets in their ancient folds, and the wind carried songs in a language the colonizers would never comprehend. The Apache had walked these canyons since time before memory, their footprints worn so deep into the earth that even the arrival of the railroad and the fort and the mining operations could not erase them. But the white settlements pushed deeper each season, and the Apache pushed back with the fierce desperation of a people watching their world dissolve like morning frost. On that particular evening, as the sun bled crimson across the desert sky and the heat finally released its stranglehold on the day, Evelyn made her way to the well behind the Banning property. The shadows stretched long and strange, and in those shadows, a figure emerged that would alter the trajectory of her existence forever. The warrior moved with the fluid silence of smoke, and the bundle he carried made no sound, which terrified Evelyn more than his presence. His eyes met hers across the distance, and in them she saw not the savage monster of frontier legend, but a father carrying a dying child, his desperation transcending every boundary of language and law. The warrior's name was Gon, though Evelyn would not learn this until much later, and the infant wrapped in deerskin against his chest was his son Yiska, burning with a fever that had already claimed 2 children in his band. The Apache held no weapon, made no threatening gesture, yet his very existence in this space violated every spoken and unspoken rule of Fort Defiance. Evelyn's heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird, as she calculated the impossible mathematics of the moment. The Banning house stood 200 yards distant, its windows like accusing eyes. The fort itself loomed on the horizon, its cannons silhouetted against the dying light. And between them, this warrior stood with his dying child, asking for the one thing the parched land could barely provide: clean water to drink. The bucket hung from her hand, filled with the precious clear water from the deep well, water the Bannings hoarded and measured like gold dust. Protocol demanded she scream. Alert the household, summon the sheriff. Protocol demanded she remember the raids, the burned homesteads, the widow Morrison who had been found scalped beside her murdered husband just last spring. Protocol demanded she see only an enemy, a savage, a threat to everything the fragile Anglo settlement represented. Instead, Evelyn saw the way Gon's hand trembled as it cradled his son's head, the careful tenderness in his calloused fingers, the way his jaw clenched against whatever words he might have spoken, had they shared a common tongue. She saw her own children's faces superimposed over that fevered infant, remembered the terror of Amos's pneumonia 2 winters past, the helpless agony of watching Ruth burn with scarlet fever. The warrior did not beg. His pride would not permit it. But his eyes carried a father's prayer that transcended every human division. Evelyn lifted the bucket, her decision made in the space between one heartbeat and the next. She crossed the distance separating their worlds, her worn boots crunching on the gravel, each step a deliberate act of treason. Up close, she could see the fever sweat dampening the infant's forehead, hear the terrible rattle in his tiny lungs. Without words, she gestured for Gon to cup his hands, then poured the clean water slowly, carefully, watching as he lifted it to his son's cracked lips. The child swallowed weakly, reflexively, and something in Gon's shoulders released just fractionally. But water alone would not break this fever. Evelyn glanced back at the Banning house, its windows now glowing with lamplight, Prudence's shadow moving past the kitchen curtains. The risk of returning to fetch medicine was absolute. Yet Evelyn found herself gesturing for Gon to wait, then hurrying back toward the house with her empty bucket, her mind racing through possibilities. The Bannings kept laudanum and willow bark powder in the pantry, supplies imported at great expense from the East. Taking them would constitute outright theft, would mark her as surely as aiding the Apache already had. She moved through the kitchen like a ghost, her presence so common it rendered her invisible. Prudence stood at the stove, her back rigid with the self-righteousness of a woman convinced of her own superiority. Evelyn's hand found the laudanum bottle, her fingers closing around the cool glass, and in that moment she discovered something about herself that 3 years of servitude had not yet crushed. She possessed a spine made not of submission, but of a stubborn, defiant compassion that recognized no borders. The bread came next, half a loaf left from supper, still warm from the oven. She wrapped it in a cloth, tucked it under her apron alongside the medicine, and walked back into the evening with her heart pounding so loudly she felt certain the entire fort could hear it. Gon waited exactly where she had left him, motionless as the stone formations that jutted from the desert floor. She pressed the items into his free hand, gestured instructions for the medicine dosage as best she could with pantomime, and watched understanding dawn in his eyes. What happened next would be debated in whispered conversations for years to come, but those present agreed on the essential facts. Gon reached beneath the deerskin wrapping that protected his son and withdrew something that caught the last rays of sunlight. A small carved figure, no longer than Evelyn's thumb, shaped from a wood so dark it appeared almost black. He pressed it into her palm, his rough fingers closing hers around it, and in his eyes she read gratitude, respect, and something else. Something that suggested this exchange had just bound them together in ways neither fully understood. Then he vanished into the shadows as silently as he had appeared, leaving Evelyn standing alone by the well, with the carved figure clutched in her hand, and her entire world about to collapse. Prudence Banning's voice cut through the evening air like a blade through cloth, sharp and merciless and filled with venomous triumph. The older woman stood on the back porch, lamplight spilling around her thin frame, her face twisted with an expression that combined horror and satisfaction in equal measure. She had seen everything, had watched the entire exchange through the kitchen window, and now she possessed the weapon she had always desired, absolute justification to destroy the woman she had never trusted, the woman whose very presence in her home felt like contamination. The reckoning came with the brutal efficiency of frontier justice, which was to say no justice at all, merely the absolute authority of those who held power over those who possessed none. Deacon Banning summoned Evelyn into his study within minutes of Prudence's discovery, and the space itself seemed designed to crush dissent. Dark wood paneling, leather-bound law books whose pages had never been opened, a massive desk that elevated the deacon above all supplicants. He did not offer her a chair. He did not raise his voice. The quiet, controlled fury in his words proved far more terrifying than any shouting could have been. He spoke of betrayal and treason, of her moral corruption and dangerous sympathies, of how her actions had placed every God-fearing soul in Fort Defiance at mortal risk. The Apache would return now, emboldened by her weakness, and blood would flow because of her foolish sentimentality. The twisted logic of his argument transformed her mercy into murder, her compassion into violence, her humanity into the very savagery he claimed to oppose. And beneath it all ran the unspoken accusation that had haunted Evelyn since Jabez's death. A woman without a husband was a woman without judgment, without morals, without the firm guiding hand needed to prevent exactly this kind of dangerous independence. The punishment manifested in stages, each more devastating than the last. First came the immediate dismissal from their service, effective instantly, without the week's notice typically afforded even to dismissed help. Then the calculation of her supposed debts, room and board for herself and her children, medical care when Amos had been ill, the cost of the bread and medicine she had stolen. The numbers on the deacon's ledger transformed 3 years of backbreaking labor into a debt that consumed every penny she had managed to save, every coin hidden in the hem of her spare dress, every cent that might have purchased her family's passage to anywhere else. But Prudence demanded more. Standing behind her husband's chair like a vengeful angel, she insisted the entire town must know what Evelyn had done, must understand the threat she represented. By dawn, the story would be carried through every street and alley of Fort Defiance, twisted and embellished, until Evelyn became not a tired widow who had shown mercy to a dying infant, but a traitor who had actively conspired with the Apache raiders, who had betrayed the settlement's security, who might have been the reason for every attack, every death, every grief the community had endured. Evelyn gathered her children as the first stars pierced the darkening sky, their few possessions bundled in a torn blanket, Amos's hand gripping hers with a terror he was too young to fully comprehend, Ruth crying softly against her shoulder. They had nowhere to go. The boarding house would not accept her now. The other families would bar their doors. Even sleeping in the livery stable risked the sheriff's intervention, for vagrants were moved along with violence in Fort Defiance, particularly vagrants marked with the stain of Indian sympathy. She fled to the only sanctuary left, the small Catholic chapel at the edge of town, where Father Elias kept a perpetual candle burning before a plaster statue of the Virgin Mary. The priest was a soft-spoken man whose own parish back east had rejected him for his radical notion that perhaps the indigenous peoples possessed souls worth saving rather than simply destroying. He listened to Evelyn's story without judgment, his weathered face growing more troubled with each revelation. And when she finished, he did something the Bannings never had. He asked her why she had done it. Evelyn's answer came quietly, without justification or apology. She had seen a father with a dying child. She had possessed the means to help. The choice between her safety and an infant's life had not felt like a choice at all, merely the natural response of anyone who still possessed a conscience. In the moment, she had not calculated consequences or considered the cost. She had simply acted as her own heart demanded, and if that made her a traitor in the eyes of Fort Defiance, then perhaps the settlement's definition of loyalty needed re-examination. Father Elias could offer little beyond sanctuary for the night and a small portion of the church's emergency funds, money meant for exactly this kind of desperate circumstance. But as Evelyn lay awake on the hard chapel floor, her children curled against her for warmth and comfort. She heard voices outside the building, angry male voices discussing fire and justice and the need to make examples. The priest appeared at her side, his face pale in the candlelight, urgency overriding his usual gentle manner. She had until dawn to disappear, he whispered. After that, he could not guarantee her safety, could not stand between her and the mob that Prudence's gossip had already begun to inflame. In those darkest hours before dawn, hope arrived in the unexpected form of Ezekiel and Martha Goodwin, homesteaders who lived on the outskirts of Fort Defiance, and had always occupied an uncertain space in the settlement's rigid social hierarchy. They arrived with a patched wagon, a pair of worn horses, and their own small savings pressed into Evelyn's hands despite her protests. The Goodwins had heard the story spreading through town, but unlike their neighbors, they had remembered their own history. Martha's grandmother had been Lenape, a fact the family carefully obscured but never entirely forgot. They understood what it meant to exist between worlds, to carry blood that the pure Anglo settlers viewed with suspicion. The Goodwins' instructions were simple and urgent. Evelyn must flee Fort Defiance immediately, must put as much distance as possible between herself and the settlement before Sheriff Judson returned from his patrol. The sheriff was a hard man who dispensed frontier justice with a rope and a sturdy tree branch, and once he heard the accusations against Evelyn, no appeal to mercy or reason would save her. The road west toward Pinnacle Creek offered her only chance, though the journey would be perilous for a woman alone with 2 small children crossing Apache country during wartime. As Evelyn climbed onto the wagon seat, Ruth and Amos huddled in the back beneath a canvas tarp. She looked back at Fort Defiance one final time. The settlement that had consumed 3 years of her life, that held her husband's memory in the Silver Mine Cemetery, that represented everything she had tried to build after loss, now felt like a prison she had narrowly escaped. The Goodwins watched her departure with expressions mixing hope and grief, knowing they might never see her again, knowing their own position in Fort Defiance would suffer for this kindness. As the wagon wheels began to turn, Evelyn's fingers found the small carved figure the Apache warrior had given her, still hidden in her pocket, its smooth wood warm from her body heat, and she wondered if she had just traded one form of survival for another, or if she had finally, for the first time since Jabez's death, acted as a free woman rather than a servant to other people's expectations. The desert transformed in the hours before dawn, the oppressive heat surrendering to a cold that bit through Evelyn's thin shawl and made her children burrow deeper into their makeshift nest of blankets. The wagon wheels creaked rhythmically against the rocky trail, each rotation carrying them further from Fort Defiance and deeper into country, where white law held no authority, and Apache war parties moved like ghosts through the arroyos and canyons. Evelyn had no map, only the Goodwins' rough directions. Follow the setting sun. Avoid the main roads where sheriff's posses traveled. Seek water in the dry washes where cottonwoods grew. And pray the Apache scouts saw her as beneath notice rather than as a target. The landscape itself seemed hostile to human passage, a vast expanse of rock and scrub and heat-blasted earth punctuated by towering saguaros that raised their arms like witnesses to crimes the desert refused to forget. Vultures circled lazy patterns against the cloudless sky, their shadows sliding across the ground like dark omens. The horses plodded forward with the resignation of animals that understood they were crossing terrain far beyond their preference, their heads low, their breathing labored, even in the relatively cool morning air. Evelyn had nothing but the clothes on her back, the Goodwins' charity money hidden in her boot, and the stubborn determination that had carried her through 3 years of servitude. Her children, blessedly, slept through most of that first day's travel, exhausted by the terror and confusion of their sudden exodus. She drove the wagon with hands that slowly remembered skills from her childhood on an Ohio farm, before marriage had carried her west into Jabez's silver mine dreams, before the territory had revealed itself as a place where hope went to die beneath the merciless sun. By afternoon, the isolation of her situation pressed down with the weight of the sky itself. No other travelers appeared on the desolate trail. No homesteads broke the monotony of stone and sage. The only signs of human passage were the occasional sun-bleached bones of an animal, or perhaps something that had once been human, picked clean and scattered by scavengers. Evelyn found herself talking to the horses, to her sleeping children, to the indifferent landscape, anything to break the crushing silence that amplified every creak of the wagon, every distant bird call that might signal watchers in the rocks. The water situation revealed itself as critical by mid-afternoon. The single canteen the Goodwins had provided would not sustain 3 people and 2 horses for more than another day. Evelyn's eyes scanned the horizon for the cottonwoods that signaled underground water, finding nothing but endless variations of brown and gray stone. Panic fluttered in her chest like a trapped moth, but she forced it down, forced herself to remember Jabez's stories about reading the land, about how desert creatures always knew where water hid, about following the flight patterns of doves and the tracks of coyotes. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of copper and blood, Evelyn spotted something that made her heart seize. A column of smoke rising against the darkening sky, perhaps 10 miles distant, too large and black to be a campfire, too sustained to be anything but a structure burning. The direction placed it roughly where Fort Defiance should be, though distance and perspective made certainty impossible. She pulled the horses to a stop, standing in the wagon to gain a few extra feet of elevation, and watched the smoke pillar grow thicker, darker, more ominous with each passing minute. The Apache had struck. Evelyn understood this with the certainty of bone-deep intuition. The raids had been promised, whispered about in hushed Fort Defiance conversations, anticipated with the fatalism of people who had built their lives on stolen land and knew retribution stalked them in the shadows. But the timing felt too precise, too pointed, as if her act of mercy had somehow triggered this response, had given the warriors permission or justification, or simply the opportunity they had been awaiting. As darkness claimed the desert completely, Evelyn made the decision to leave the trail entirely, guiding the horses into a narrow canyon where high stone walls would hide the wagon from any pursuing eyes. She built no fire, afraid the light would draw attention. Instead, she wrapped her children close, felt their small bodies trembling with cold and fear, and told them stories about Ohio, about their father, about a future she could barely imagine but described with fierce conviction. They would reach Pinnacle Creek. They would find work, shelter, a new beginning. The hardship was temporary. The fear would pass, and on the far side of this nightmare they would find peace. But peace was not yet ready to find them. Near midnight, as Amos finally drifted into fitful sleep and Ruth's breathing steadied into the deep rhythm of exhausted childhood, Evelyn heard horses approaching, multiple riders moving with purpose along the main trail she had abandoned. Male voices carried through the cold night air, harsh with anger and determination, and among them she recognized Sheriff Judson's distinctive drawl, discussing trackers and justice, and the woman who had betrayed Fort Defiance. The posse had ridden out faster than expected, and the story they carried had evolved in the telling. According to the fragments Evelyn could hear, she was no longer simply an Indian sympathizer. She had become the architect of Fort Defiance's destruction, the traitor who had signaled the Apache raiders, whose information had led them directly to the Banning estate. Deacon Banning himself was dead, cut down in the attack, and Prudence's testimony placed the blame squarely on the woman who had aided the savages just hours before the raid. The logic was twisted, impossible, built on nothing but grief and prejudice, and the need to assign blame to someone within reach. But frontier justice rarely required evidence, only accusation and a rope. The posse passed within 100 yards of her hidden canyon, their torches creating dancing shadows against the rock walls, their horses' hooves striking sparks from the stone trail. Evelyn crouched in the wagon bed with her hands covering her children's mouths, praying they would not wake and cry out, barely breathing herself as the riders debated which direction a fleeing woman might take. Then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the sounds faded westward, following the main trail. The sheriff convinced Evelyn would seek the fastest route to Pinnacle Creek rather than the hidden paths through the mountains. But Evelyn would not reach Pinnacle Creek by following any marked trail. As dawn broke across the desert in shades of pearl and rose, she heard different horses approaching, moving with the near-silent grace that marked Apache riders. Her hand instinctively sought a weapon she did not possess, as 3 warriors emerged from the canyon shadows, their faces painted for war, their rifles carried with casual confidence. Behind them rode an older man whose bearing suggested authority, and beside him, the warrior she recognized even in different light, even without the desperate burden of a dying child. Gone, alive, armed, and riding directly toward her wagon with an expression that held no threat, only an intensity of purpose that made her breath catch. The Apache warriors positioned themselves around Evelyn's wagon with the precise efficiency of men who had spent lifetimes moving through hostile territory, their horses barely disturbing the dust, their presence transforming the narrow canyon from hiding place to trap in the span of heartbeats. Amos woke with a strangled gasp, his eyes going wide with the terror every Anglo child learned from cradle stories about savage raiders and scalping knives. Ruth whimpered against her mother's chest, and Evelyn felt her own heart hammering with a fear that transcended rational thought, tapping into generations of frontier paranoia. But Gon dismounted with hands deliberately visible and empty, his rifle remaining secured to his saddle, and the older warrior beside him made a gesture that in any language communicated patience and peace. The morning light revealed details Evelyn had missed in the previous evening's desperate twilight encounter. Gon's face bore the angular features and deep-set eyes of a man who had seen too much death, but also the careful attention of someone who missed nothing, who read meaning in the smallest gestures. The older warrior, whose age showed in silver threading through his long black hair, carried himself with an authority that suggested leadership, wisdom earned through survival, rather than simply granted by birthright. Gon spoke then, his voice low and steady, using a mixture of Spanish words and hand gestures that created a crude but comprehensible communication. The infant Yiska lived, the fever broken by the medicine Evelyn had provided. The debt between them was therefore sacred, governed by laws older than the white man's settlements, older than the treaties that had been made and broken like dried branches across the decades. Honor demanded repayment. Honor demanded protection. And honor had brought them here now to a woman fleeing justice she did not deserve, pursued by men who understood nothing of true law. The older warrior, whose name sounded like Nalte in Evelyn's uncertain hearing, gestured toward the main trail where the sheriff's posse had passed hours earlier. He spoke rapidly in Apache, and Gon translated fragments into Spanish. The white men hunted with blind rage. They sought blood to answer blood. They would find Evelyn if she continued on the western trails. But there were other paths. Older paths, routes through the mountains that the settlers' maps had never recorded, ways known only to those who had walked this land since the first humans learned to read stone and shadow. Evelyn's mind raced through impossible calculations. Trusting the Apache meant abandoning everything she knew about survival in the territory, meant placing her children's lives in the hands of the very people Fort Defiance had taught her to fear as demons in human form. But staying meant capture, meant a rope and a quick drop, meant orphaning Amos and Ruth to whatever cruel charity the settlement might extend to the children of a convicted traitor. And beneath the fear and calculation ran a deeper current of recognition. These men had traveled through dangerous country to honor a debt, had risked encounter with militia patrols to reach her, had offered protection when every Anglo door had slammed shut. The decision crystallized in a moment of absolute clarity. Evelyn nodded once, firmly, meeting Gon's eyes directly despite the cultural prohibition she had learned about such direct eye contact. She gestured to her children, to the wagon, to the open trail beyond, and in that gesture communicated her trust, however fragile and terrified. Gon's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, something like respect flickering across his features, and he turned to speak rapidly to Nalte and the other warriors. What followed tested every assumption Evelyn had carried about the territory and its peoples. The Apache warriors moved with a coordination born of absolute necessity, their actions economical and purposeful. They fashioned a travois from branches and rope, transferring supplies from the wagon to create a more mobile transport. The wagon itself, they explained through gestures and broken Spanish, would be too visible, too slow for the mountain paths. Better to hide it in the canyon to continue on horseback with the children riding double and the essential supplies packed on the travois. Amos watched these preparations with eyes huge in his thin face, his childhood terror warring with fascination as the warriors worked. One of the younger Apache, whose face bore the smooth features of a man barely into his 20s, noticed the boy's interest and, without breaking his work rhythm, demonstrated how to properly secure a knot, how to test the rope's tension, small lessons in survival offered without words or fanfare. Ruth remained pressed against Evelyn's side, but her crying had stopped, her attention caught by the intricate beadwork on Nalte's leather vest. The journey into the mountains began as the sun reached its zenith, transforming the desert into a furnace that made breathing feel like inhaling knives. But the Apache led them away from the exposed valleys and into canyons, where ancient rock formations provided shade, where hidden springs fed pools of clear water that sustained life invisible from any trail. The warriors moved in formation that revealed tactical genius, one riding ahead to scout, two flanking to watch for pursuit. Nalte and Gan staying close to Evelyn and her children, protecting the vulnerable center of their small column. The landscape transformed with each mile, the flat desert giving way to rising terrain, where piñon pines clung to rocky slopes and juniper trees twisted themselves into impossible shapes. Evelyn had never seen this part of the territory, had never imagined such places existed within the endless brown wasteland visible from Fort Defiance. Here, the land revealed its secrets slowly, grudgingly, only to those who knew how to read its subtle language. As afternoon stretched toward evening, they climbed higher still, following a trail so faint Evelyn could barely distinguish it from random erosion patterns. But the Apache horses navigated it with sure-footed confidence, and gradually Evelyn understood they were following paths worn by countless generations. Routes that connected water sources and hunting grounds, and defensive positions in a network invisible to settlers' eyes. This was not empty land waiting for civilization's arrival. This was a landscape already mapped, already named, already loved by people who had never needed European confirmation of their existence. They made camp that night in a natural amphitheater formed by curved rock walls, a space that trapped warmth while hiding firelight from any distant watchers. The warriors built a small fire using techniques that produced almost no smoke, and heated strips of dried meat and corn cakes that they shared without ceremony or expectation. Amos accepted food from the young warrior with trembling hands, his fear giving way to hunger's more immediate demands. Ruth fell asleep against Evelyn's shoulder before eating, exhausted beyond awareness. Gan sat across the fire from Evelyn, his face half illuminated by the dancing flames, and for the first time since this journey began, she felt the weight of what had happened fully settle onto her shoulders. She had saved a child and lost everything. She had shown mercy and been branded traitor. She had fled into the wilderness and found sanctuary with those her entire culture had taught her to despise as savages. And now she sat sharing food and fire with warriors whose people had every reason to kill her, whose own survival hung by threads the Anglo settlement seemed determined to cut. Gan spoke then, his Spanish halting but determined, and through the broken phrases, Evelyn pieced together a story that mirrored her own in uncomfortable ways. His wife had died in childbirth 3 seasons past, leaving him with infant Yiska and the crushing responsibility of fatherhood in the midst of warfare. The fever that had nearly claimed his son had already taken other children in their band, and traditional medicine had failed. His journey to Fort Defiance had been an act of desperation, one that violated every tactical principle his people followed, one that should have resulted in his death or capture. Instead, he had found a woman whose compassion transcended the divisions that were destroying both their peoples. That single act had saved not just Yiska's life, but Gan's own reason for continuing to fight, for continuing to resist the inevitable crushing weight of the Anglo expansion. The debt was therefore infinite, impossible to repay, but honor demanded the attempt. Hence this journey, this protection, this offering of safe passage through country where white law held no power and Apache justice reigned absolute. Nalte spoke then, his voice carrying the weight of years and wisdom, and Gayan translated with careful attention. The old warrior told of watching the settlements grow like poison spreading through water, of treaties made and broken before the ink dried, of massacres and retributions, and the slow, grinding destruction of everything his people had built across centuries. But he also spoke of a deeper truth, that individual acts of humanity mattered more than tribal affiliation, that the sacred law of debt and honor transcended the artificial boundaries drawn by those who sought to divide the land. As the fire burned down to coals and the desert cold crept back into the canyon, Evelyn pulled her children close and stared up at stars so bright and numerous, they seemed to form a second landscape above the first. She was further from Fort Defiance than she had ever imagined traveling, deeper into danger and strangeness than her Ohio farm girl imagination could have conceived. Yet she was also safer than she had been in 3 years of servitude to the Bannings, protected by laws more ancient than any the territory government claimed to enforce. The contradiction twisted through her thoughts as sleep finally claimed her, and she dreamed of Jabez in the silver mines, digging tunnels through stone that echoed with the footsteps of those who had walked these mountains long before his arrival, and would walk them long after his death. The second day's journey carried them higher into mountains that scraped against the belly of the sky, the air thinning until each breath felt earned rather than given. Evelyn's legs ached from the unfamiliar position of riding. Her back screamed from supporting Ruth's weight, but she uttered no complaint, understanding instinctively that showing weakness here would be not just shameful, but dangerous. The Apache respected strength, not the brute force strength of Deacon Banning's worldview, but the quiet endurance strength of those who survived because surrender was not an option. Around midday, they reached a place where the trail widened into a natural terrace, and here Nalte called a halt, gesturing for silence with urgency that needed no translation. Far below, barely visible as dust trails against the desert floor, riders moved in formation, the sheriff's posse, or perhaps militia from one of the other settlements, hunting with the methodical determination of men who believed righteousness sanctioned any violence. They were too far distant to pose immediate threat, but their presence confirmed what Evelyn had feared. They would not abandon their pursuit, would not allow a traitor to escape justice, would track her across the entire territory if necessary. One of the younger warriors spoke rapidly to Nalte, gesturing toward the distant riders with obvious agitation, and Evelyn caught fragments of the debate that followed. Some advocated for eliminating the threat permanently, for ambushing the posse in one of the narrow canyons where their numbers would mean nothing against strategic position. Others argued for preservation of their own safety, for avoiding conflict that might bring larger military forces into these mountains. The discussion revealed fault lines within the group, tensions between those who sought immediate tactical advantage and those who calculated longer-term survival. Gon's voice cut through the debate with quiet authority, and though Evelyn could not understand his words, she grasped his meaning from gesture and tone. They would continue deeper into the mountains, would use the terrain itself as their primary defense, would rely on the white men's ignorance of these ancient paths to provide security. Violence would be employed only as absolute last resort, because every Anglo death brought retaliation, brought more troops, brought the slow tightening of the noose around the Apache's remaining free spaces. The journey resumed with renewed urgency, the warriors pushing a faster pace that tested both horses and humans. The landscape grew increasingly dramatic, the trail now traversing slopes where a single misstep would send rider and mount tumbling hundreds of feet into rocky ravines. Amos rode ahead with the young warrior, his initial terror transformed into something approaching wonder as he experienced the territory from this elevated perspective. Ruth had stopped crying entirely, had instead developed a silent watchfulness that made her seem older than her 5 years. By late afternoon, they reached their destination, a hidden encampment tucked into a canyon so narrow and twisted that Evelyn understood how it could remain unknown to the military patrols that supposedly mapped and controlled the territory. The band that emerged to greet them numbered perhaps 40 souls, from ancient grandmothers whose faces carried the geography of hard lives, to infants strapped to cradleboards, with hunters and warriors and women going about the complex business of survival in a hostile world. The arrival of Nalte's group with an Anglo woman and her children created immediate commotion, voices raised in question or objection, hands reaching for weapons before Gon's explanations calmed the agitation. The story of Yiska's rescue spread through the camp with the speed of wind through dry grass, and gradually, the hostile suspicion in watching eyes transformed into something more complex: curiosity, uncertainty, and perhaps a grudging respect. An elderly woman, her face creased with lines as deep as canyon walls, approached Evelyn with a directness that permitted no evasion. She examined Ruth and Amos with clinical attention, checking teeth and fingernails and hair with the practiced efficiency of someone who understood health and illness as matters of life and death. Then she spoke rapidly to Gon, her tone suggesting either command or advice, and gestured for Evelyn to follow. The Apache camp revealed organization and sophistication that Fort Defiance's propaganda had never acknowledged. Shelters constructed from branches and hides provided protection, while remaining mobile and invisible from distance. Food preparation areas showed careful attention to hygiene and efficiency. Children played games that were simultaneously entertainment and tactical training. Every adult moved with purposeful efficiency, tending fires, treating hides, maintaining weapons, creating the complex infrastructure necessary for a people living under constant threat. Evelyn and her children were given space in one of the shelters, a courtesy that came with watchful eyes and uncertain welcome. Women brought food, not the familiar Anglo fare, but corn cakes and piñon nuts, and strips of dried venison that tasted of smoke and salt and survival. They gestured instructions about the camp's layout, about where water could be drawn and where waste should be deposited, about the invisible rules that governed communal living in close quarters. Amos devoured the food with the appetite of a growing boy, while Ruth picked at hers suspiciously before hunger overcame caution. As evening transformed the canyon into a cathedral of shadow and firelight, Gon approached with his son Yiska cradled against his chest. The infant had gained weight since their first meeting, his color healthy, his eyes alert and curious. Gon placed the child briefly in Evelyn's arms, a gesture of trust and gratitude that transcended linguistic barriers. The baby's small hand curled around Evelyn's finger, and for a moment the entire situation compressed into something simple and profound. Life had been preserved, a debt had been honored, and two people from warring worlds had discovered their essential humanity. The elderly woman who had examined the children returned, carrying something wrapped in soft leather. She unfolded the package slowly, revealing a necklace of polished turquoise stones, each one shaped and smoothed by countless hours of patient work. The turquoise caught the firelight and seemed to hold it, glowing with an inner radiance that made the stones appear almost alive. Gon spoke then, his Spanish careful and formal, explaining that this necklace had belonged to his mother, that it represented protection and honor within his people's traditions, that by accepting it, Evelyn would be claiming a place within the web of obligations and respect that governed Apache society. Evelyn's hands trembled as she accepted the necklace. Understanding this was not simply jewelry, but a sacred symbol, a statement that had consequences she could barely fathom. The weight of the turquoise settled against her collarbone like a second heartbeat, and she looked around the camp at faces that watched with expressions ranging from approval to skepticism. She had entered this canyon as a fugitive, an Anglo widow with no power or position. She was leaving it, she realized, as something else entirely, a woman who had been judged worthy by those Fort Defiance considered unworthy of judgment. The old shaman, whose role in the band only gradually became apparent, approached as the camp settled into night routines. She touched the turquoise necklace with gnarled fingers, then placed her hand over Evelyn's heart, speaking words in Apache that sounded like blessing or prophecy. Gon translated slowly, carefully. Warrior hearts came in many forms, the old woman said, not only in those who carried rifles and counted coup. A mother who protected her children possessed warrior spirit. A woman who showed mercy in the face of consequences possessed warrior courage. The heart that beat beneath the turquoise was not made of settler's steel, but of something far stronger. Love that transcended fear, compassion that defied convention, humanity that refused to be crushed by brutality. That night, as Evelyn lay between her sleeping children in the Apache shelter, listening to the camp's night sounds so different from Fort Defiance's familiar rhythms, she felt something shift within her understanding of the territory and her place in it. The Anglo settlements saw only savages to be eliminated, obstacles to progress, darkness to be enlightened. But she had seen families struggling to survive, elders carrying wisdom, warriors showing honor, and mothers loving their children with the same fierce devotion that animated every human heart, regardless of the language it dreamed in. The Apache kept Evelyn and her children in their hidden encampment for 6 days, a period that existed outside normal time, suspended between her past life and whatever uncertain future awaited. The band moved with the cautious efficiency of people who understood that survival meant constant vigilance, that complacency invited destruction. Scouts ranged out daily, returning with reports about military patrols and settler movements, about the sheriff's posse that continued searching the lower valleys, about the rumors spreading through Anglo settlements regarding the woman who had betrayed Fort Defiance. The stories that filtered back painted Evelyn not as traitor, but as witch, not as sympathizer, but as willing conspirator, each retelling adding new layers of exaggeration, until she became a monster in white skin, a woman who had deliberately led Apache warriors to slaughter innocent civilians. Prudence Banning's testimony had transformed grief into weapon, accusing Evelyn not just of aiding the enemy, but of actively planning the raid that had killed Deacon and several other prominent citizens. The fact that Evelyn had been fleeing Fort Defiance when the attack occurred mattered nothing to frontier justice hungry for a target. During those 6 days, Evelyn learned lessons that no Anglo schoolhouse would ever teach. She learned how the Apache women could identify edible plants in landscape that appeared barren, how they processed acorns and mesquite beans into flour, how they created containers and tools from materials the settlers dismissed as worthless. She watched the warriors train, their movements economical and precise, built on generations of tactical knowledge earned through survival against increasingly impossible odds. She observed the children playing games that taught tracking and stealth, and the reading of signs written in disturbed sand and bent grass. Amos thrived in ways that would have horrified Fort Defiance. The young warrior who had first shown him kindness became something between friend and teacher, demonstrating how to move silently, how to read weather and cloud formations, how to find north without compass or stars. The boy absorbed these lessons with the hunger of someone discovering capabilities he had never been permitted to explore under the Bannings regime. Ruth remained more cautious, staying close to her mother, but even she began responding to the gentle attention of Apache women who treated the children not as Anglo spawn, but simply as young ones who needed care. On the 7th morning, as dawn painted the canyon walls in shades of amber and gold, Nalte announced through Gon's translation that the time had come for Evelyn to continue toward Pinnacle Creek. The sheriff's search had finally turned back toward Fort Defiance, the posse's supplies exhausted, and their determination finally broken by the inhospitable terrain. The Apache scouts had identified a safe route that would bypass Anglo settlements until she reached the outskirts of Pinnacle Creek itself, a larger town with less rigid social structure and more tolerance for those who arrived with uncertain histories. The band prepared supplies for her journey with a generosity that shamed Evelyn's memory of Fort Defiance's supposed Christian charity. Dried meat and corn cakes, water containers made from animal bladders, a new blanket woven from rabbit fur, clothing altered to fit Amos and Ruth properly. The gifts came without ceremony or expectation of repayment, simply offered as necessities for survival. Gon presented her with a knife, its blade worn but perfectly maintained, its handle wrapped in leather soft from years of use. For protection, he explained through sparse Spanish, though they both understood it represented something more. Trust, respect, and the acknowledgement that she now carried responsibility for her own defense. The farewell stretched through the morning as individual families approached to offer final gifts or words in Apache she could not understand, but felt in her bones. The old shaman touched her forehead and chest in a gesture that felt like blessing, then did the same for Amos and Ruth. The young warrior who had befriended Amos pressed a small carved figure into the boy's hands, a twin to the one Gon had given Evelyn that desperate twilight by the Fort Defiance well. The women who had shared their shelter embraced Evelyn in a manner that transcended language, their arms communicating solidarity, survival, and the unspoken acknowledgement that all women knew what it meant to protect children in a world determined to destroy them. Gon and 2 warriors accompanied them down from the mountain camp, guiding them along paths so hidden Evelyn could never have found them alone. The descent took most of the day, the landscape gradually transforming from pine-covered heights back to scrub desert, the air warming and thinning as elevation fell away. They stopped at a final vantage point, where 3 valleys converged, and Gon pointed toward the western horizon where dust and distance obscured details, but suggested human habitation. Pinnacle Creek lay 2 days' journey along the valley floor, he explained. A settlement large enough that one more widow with children would attract little attention. The Goodwin's money hidden in Evelyn's boot would purchase land and supplies sufficient for basic establishment. The turquoise necklace she wore would identify her to those few traders who maintained relationships with Apache bands, would open doors that would otherwise remain closed to a woman alone, and the scars of her ordeal, visible in the new hardness around her eyes and the set of her shoulders, would mark her as someone who had survived trials that killed weaker souls. Before departing, Gon spoke at length in Spanish, his words careful and deliberate, ensuring understanding. The debt between them was not settled, he explained, because such debts could never be truly balanced when life itself was the currency. But honor had been served, obligation had been met, and now their paths diverged into separate futures. The territory was changing, he said, the old ways dying beneath the weight of railroad iron and mining operations, and the endless arrival of settlers who saw only empty land waiting for their taking. The Apache would fight as long as fighting remained possible, would resist as long as resistance had meaning. But the outcome was written in the demographics and the industrial capacity that backed the Anglo expansion. What mattered, Gon said, was that they had both discovered the same truth. Humanity transcended tribal affiliation. Honor lived in individual actions rather than collective identity, and the greatest acts of courage often looked like nothing more than simple decency. Evelyn had saved his son not because Yiska was Apache, but because he was a child in desperate need. Gon had protected Evelyn not because she was white, but because she had shown mercy when mercy meant sacrifice. These acts would echo forward through time in ways neither could predict, would plant seeds that might someday flower into understanding between peoples who currently saw only enemies. Then the warriors mounted their horses and rode back toward the mountains, their forms growing smaller until distance and heat shimmer erased them entirely from view, leaving Evelyn standing alone with her children at the threshold of her new life. She looked down at Amos and Ruth, saw in their faces the transformation that survival had wrought. They were no longer the cowering, broken children who had scrubbed floors in the Banning household. They had witnessed different ways of living, had experienced kindness from unexpected sources, had learned that the world contained more complexity and possibility than Fort Defiance's rigid categories allowed. The journey to Pinnacle Creek proved less arduous than the flight from Fort Defiance, perhaps because fear no longer drove them, or perhaps because Evelyn now moved with different authority. The turquoise necklace visible at her throat marking her as someone who had crossed boundaries most settlers never approached. They encountered other travelers on the final approach to the settlement, and though faces showed curiosity at the sight of a lone woman with children wearing Apache jewelry, no one challenged or questioned them. Pinnacle Creek existed as frontier settlements did. Raw, pragmatic, too concerned with survival and profit to invest heavily in anyone else's past. The town itself sprawled across a wide valley where year-round springs fed actual growing vegetation, a green strip of defiance against the desert's brown dominance. False front buildings lined the main street, their paint already fading under the harsh sun. The sound of hammering and sawing suggested constant construction, the settlement growing like a living organism responding to the mineral wealth being torn from nearby mountains. Miners mixed with ranchers, merchants argued with freighters, and women went about their business with the tired determination of those building civilization from nothing but will and stubbornness. Evelyn found the land office in a building that smelled of paper and tobacco smoke, and there she met the clerk, a rail-thin man named Hawkins, who listened to her request with the weary cynicism of someone who had heard every frontier story and believed none. She wanted to purchase land, she explained, something small but with water access, something where she could establish a home for her children. Hawkins studied her with eyes that calculated and assessed, taking in the worn dress and the Apache necklace, the tired children, and the woman's evident determination. The land he eventually showed her on the hand-drawn map would never have been anyone's first choice. Rocky, Resistant soil at the edge of the settlement's claimed territory, bordered by an arroyo that flooded dangerously in rare storms but provided reliable water the rest of the year. The price consumed most of the Goodwins' gift and left her with barely enough for tools and initial supplies. But the deed was clean, the boundaries clear, and most importantly, represented something Evelyn had not possessed since Jabez's death: agency, ownership, the legal right to build a life according to her own design rather than someone else's demands. She built a shelter first, not a proper house, but a sturdy lean-to constructed from scavenged lumber and skills, learned by watching the Apache adapt materials to necessity. Amos helped with the enthusiasm of a boy finally permitted to be useful, his small hands learning to hammer nails and tie knots. Ruth gathered stones for the fire ring, arranged them with the careful attention to pattern that would mark all her future endeavors. The first night in their new home, such as it was, Evelyn lay staring up at stars visible through gaps in the roof and felt something she had forgotten existed. Hope, fragile and uncertain but unmistakably present. The following weeks tested that hope against frontier reality. The land resisted cultivation with the stubbornness of earth that had known only desert plants for millennia. Water had to be hauled from the arroyo, the weight of the buckets leaving permanent calluses on Evelyn's already rough hands. The few vegetables she managed to coax from the soil grew stunted and bitter, subsisting on sheer determination rather than favorable conditions. Money dwindled at a terrifying rate, each necessary purchase requiring calculation and sacrifice. But slowly, impossibly, something took root and held. Other families on Pinnacle Creek's periphery, those who occupied similar uncertain space in the settlement's social hierarchy, began offering guarded friendship. A Mexican family taught Evelyn how to make adobe bricks, showed her techniques for desert gardening that her Ohio farming knowledge had never included. A former slave named Washington, who operated a small blacksmith shop, traded metalwork for Ruth's help with reading, the girl's education from Fort Defiance proving to have value in this place where literacy meant power. A Yaqui woman named Socorro recognized the turquoise necklace's tribal origins and began stopping by to share food, to offer advice, to create the kind of informal women's network that sustained frontier life when formal institutions failed. Amos found work with a freight company, driving wagons and tending horses for coins that accumulated slowly into something approaching financial stability. The boy who had arrived in Pinnacle Creek still haunted by Fort Defiance's trauma began walking taller, his shoulders broadening as adolescence approached. Ruth attended the settlement's small school, where a teacher named Miss Holland recognized intelligence that Fort Defiance had tried to crush. Evelyn herself took in mending and laundry, work that consumed hours but allowed her to remain close to home, to build slowly toward the kind of security that could not be stolen by a Deacon banning or destroyed by a sheriff's accusation. Seasons turned, and the raw wounds of Fort Defiance gradually scarred over without fully healing. Evelyn never spoke of her time with the Apache band, understanding instinctively that some experiences existed beyond language, beyond explanation to those who measured the territory only in terms of conquest and civilization. But she wore the turquoise necklace openly, and those who possessed eyes to see understood what it represented. A woman who had crossed boundaries most settlers never approached, who had found honor among those Fort Defiance called savages, who had survived not through submission, but through the fierce exercise of her own conscience. Years accumulated like sediment in the arroyo, each layer adding thickness to the life Evelyn built from nothing but determination. Amos grew to manhood and took over the freight business, his reputation for honesty and reliability becoming currency more valuable than gold. Ruth married a schoolteacher from back east who saw in her not a frontier orphan, but an intelligent, capable woman worthy of partnership. And Evelyn, the widow who had been branded traitor for offering water to a dying child, became simply Mrs. Carter, a respected if somewhat mysterious figure who owned her small piece of territory absolutely, and who answered to no authority but her own conscience. She never returned to Fort Defiance, though news occasionally filtered through the freight networks about its gradual decline, as the silver played out and the railroad bypassed it in favor of more profitable routes. She never saw Gon or the Apache band again, though sometimes travelers brought stories about a warrior who had become a respected voice during the painful treaty negotiations that followed the Apache War's effective conclusion. She never forgot the turquoise's weight against her collarbone, the constant reminder of the debt that had saved her life, and the lesson learned in firelight beneath mountain stars. That humanity possessed no single face, that courage came in unexpected forms, and that the truest measure of civilization was not conquest or dominion, but the small acts of mercy that transcended tribal hatred. On a spring evening in 1896, as Evelyn sat on her porch watching grandchildren play in the yard of what had become a proper farmstead, the turquoise necklace still visible beneath her collar, she thought about that desperate twilight, 18 years prior, when a warrior had emerged from shadow carrying a dying child. She thought about the choice that had cost her everything, and had given her everything. The moment when compassion had overwhelmed fear, and had set in motion events that had transformed not just her existence, but the existence of everyone connected to her. The Wild West that Pinnacle Creek's newspapers romanticized had been nothing like its legend, not heroic or noble, but brutal and unforgiving. A place where survival required moral compromises, and where justice was a luxury most could not afford. But within that brutality, small acts of decency had possessed power, all out of proportion to their scale. A cup of water offered to an enemy had rippled forward through time, creating waves that washed up on shores no one could have predicted. Amos arrived that evening with his own children, and Ruth drove down from her home in town with her teacher husband and their brood. They gathered around Evelyn's table, 4 generations now if one counted the newest infant, and ate food grown from land that Evelyn owned absolutely. The conversation flowed in English and Spanish and the occasional Apache phrase that the children had learned from trading post interactions, a linguistic mixture that would have horrified Fort Defiance's insistence on cultural purity. And, as the desert stars emerged overhead, those same stars that had witnessed the meeting by the well and the flight through mountains, and the slow building of a life from ruins, Evelyn touched the turquoise necklace one more time and understood its true message. That home was not a place but a collection of choices. That family was whoever you protected with your life, and that the only honor worth possessing was the honor that came from acting according to your own heart's compass, regardless of the cost. The warrior had asked for fresh water to drink. She had given it freely, and in that exchange, in that moment of radical compassion in a land built on radical violence, she had discovered the only truth that mattered. That one person choosing mercy over fear, choosing humanity over tribalism, could alter the outcome of not just their own story, but of everyone connected to them, rippling forward through time until even the desert bloomed with unexpected life. Did this story speak to you? Have you ever faced a moment where showing compassion meant risking everything? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and tell us where in the world you're listening from. If you want more stories from the frontier that challenge what you thought you knew about the Wild West, subscribe to the channel, and join us for the next journey into history's hidden corners, where the real heroes often wore no badge and claimed no glory, but changed the world, one quiet act of courage at a time.